When Franklin Delano Roosevelt became president in 1933, in the midst of the Great Depression, one of his main goals was to rein in the recklessness and unchecked power of Wall Street, big banks, and big business. And the men who ran these enterprises hated him for it. They gave speeches, wrote editorials, and took out ads that raged against FDR and the New Deal. But FDR had one huge advantage over them, something his cousin Theodore had dubbed the bully pulpit. Let's give a listen.
We had to struggle with the old enemies of peace, business and financial monopoly, speculation, reckless banking, class antagonism, and we know now that government by organized money is just as dangerous as government by organized mob. Never before in all our history have these forces been so united against one candidate as they stand today. They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
Yeah, I wonder who won that struggle. You are listening to In the Past Lane, the podcast about history and why it matters.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more
to huddled masses yearning to breathe free.
Consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill.
That all men and women are created equal.
Give me liberty or give me death.
Nobody's free until everybody's free.
The government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
History matters because it's not just about the past. History's about us, here and now. It explains the world we live in and why things are the way they are. And history gives us insights into how to achieve a more just, peaceful, and prosperous future. So people, let's do this. Hi there, everyone. Welcome to In the Past Lane, the podcast about history and why it matters. I'm host Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, and this is In the Past Lane, episode 30. In which we take on the history of the American presidency and how presidents have succeeded and failed to get their message across to the American people. That's right, it's the history of spin. We are coming to you this week from the George Gallup Studios, located on the campus of Holy Cross College in Worcester, Massachusetts. You can learn more about me, this podcast, and our guests at our website, inthepastlane.com, and on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Calling all the shots, as always, is our wonderful executive producer, Lulu Spencer. So how's everyone doing out there? The 4th of July weekend is upon us, so happy Independence Day, everyone. I hope you all get a chance to enjoy some time outdoors, going to the beach or doing some backyard grilling. And no matter where you are, I hope you get a chance to enjoy a few cold ones, ice cream, fireworks, all that. In case you couldn't tell, I'm a big fan of July 4th weekend. I like the recreational aspects of it, of course, but I also like the way July 4th reminds us of the nation's founding and those stirring ideals in the Declaration of Independence that we've always struggled to live up to. And speaking of all that, if you want to brush up on your July 4th and Declaration of Independence history, check out In the Past Lane's episode number 14. So, what's up at In the Past Lane this week? Well, given all the talk these days about presidential tweets, fake news, and alternative facts and the like, it seems like a really good time to take on the topic of presidents and their efforts to communicate their message to the American people. It's a story as old as the presidency itself. To help us make sense of this incredibly interesting and important topic, I sit down with historian David Greenberg, author of Republic of Spin, an inside history of the American presidency. He'll take us on a wide-ranging examination of the presidents and how they've used, some successfully and others not so much, new techniques, new tactics, and new technologies to get their message to the electorate. In other words, to put their particular spin on the issues of the day. Okay, people, there be spinning up ahead, so better take some Dramamine. Your journey in the past lane begins now. Welcome back to In the Past Lane. I'm host Edward T. O'Donnell, and with me now is David Greenberg. David is a historian of American politics, in particular, the politics related to the American presidency. He's a professor at Rutgers University, where he teaches courses in American history and journalism and media studies. David is the author of several books, including Nixon's Shadow, The History of an Image, and the biography Calvin Coolidge. David also writes political analysis pieces for publications such as The New York Times, The Washington Post, The Atlantic, and Politico. David's latest book, recently out in paperback, is The Republic of Spin, An Inside History of the American Presidency. David Greenberg, welcome to In the Past Lane.
Thank you, Ed, for having me on. It's really a pleasure.
Well, I really enjoyed your book. It's quite the remarkable tour of presidential history, starting with Theodore Roosevelt. And that actually leads me to my first question. The subtitle of your book is An Inside History of the American Presidency. But you choose to start with Theodore Roosevelt, so that raises the question, what about the other presidents that lead up to him? Weren't at least some of them, on some levels, to some degree, engaged in image control, message control, trying to shape the way the public understands events? I'm thinking here about some of the things that Lincoln did. So what went into your decision to start with TR? I know you need to start somewhere, but why start with Roosevelt?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I do certainly agree that presidents before Roosevelt engaged in spin, in trying to shape their images, their messages, trying to influence public opinion. In fact, I would argue this is inherent in political leadership from time immemorial. You look at the Greeks and the role of rhetoric in the politics of ancient Athens.
Right.
So, and that involves persuasion and trying to put across a message. What's different, starting around Roosevelt, and a few of his immediate predecessors contribute to this as well, is the construction of what becomes a permanent White House spin machine. So the history starts with Roosevelt not because presidents before him didn't spin, but because only with Teddy Roosevelt do you get the beginnings, the foundations of an apparatus that subsequent presidents then have it available for them to use.
And is it fair to say that it's both an apparatus and also a mindset? That Roosevelt, part of what makes him new or different, is that he has a really modern awareness and a really innovative idea about how to do mass politics that really departs from his predecessors. And so is that the insight that leads to the PR apparatus? Or is it that the apparatus is already there, already in the making, and he just takes it to the next level?
No, I think you're right. The apparatus follows from Roosevelt's fairly radical view of the presidency. Roosevelt, in his autobiography, talks about what has come to be called the stewardship theory. He says that other presidents confine themselves to those things that they were specifically permitted to do by the Constitution, whereas he saw it as his charge to do whatever he could so long as it was not prohibited by the Constitution. Now, that may be a bit self-serving and a bit overdrawn. Certainly, there were a few powerful presidents before him, like Lincoln and Andrew Jackson, although it's also notable that TR specifically cites Lincoln and Andrew Jackson as his models, yes, that he sees them as exceptions who did try to make full use of the powers of the presidency. There's also a historical point that, this is happening after the Gilded Age, after the Industrial Revolution has really transformed the nature of social and economic life in the United States, and certain problems of inequality, of labor, had reached a point that progressives like Teddy Roosevelt thought there was no force in society able to address them except the federal government. And within the federal government, because of the bulky nature of Congress, it had to be the president. So his vision of an activist president and activist presidency sort of follows from a perceived need to address these problems that weren't getting dealt with adequately throughout society. And the way he wants to mobilize public opinion behind him is by developing new tools of media management. This is how he builds public support for his agenda.
Yeah, and as you point out, the actual phrase public opinion, or the idea of public opinion, is a concept that's emerging in the progressive era. And Roosevelt invokes public opinion. And he says it's the source of my legitimacy. And the legitimacy of my ideas and my reforms comes from the fact that I'm acting on behalf of the people. At one point, as you note, he says, people see me as the democracy. And he's going to use that pressure, as you say, to move, calcified Congress to do some pretty bold things. I mean, the two examples you cite in particular are getting the Hepburn Act passed, regulating railroads, which at the time were the largest corporations in America, and also the Meat Inspection Act. Could you tell our listeners more about one or both of these incidents?
Right. Well, the Meat Inspection Act is actually a great example. People generally know of it because they associate it with Upton Sinclair's novel The Jungle, which was a novel, but it was based on real conditions, and Sinclair had gone to investigate the stockyards, the meat packing houses in Chicago to see really what terrible conditions existed. So there were a lot of writers, a lot of activists who were agitating for various kinds of regulation, including on issues like this. What's interesting, and what I didn't know before doing the research for the book, is the way that Sinclair and Roosevelt really lock arms to make this fight together. They send the president galleys of the book so he can see it in advance. He's separately talking about these reforms, but the book's popularity kind of gives Roosevelt a handle to try to push for reform. So he sends his own investigators out to check out the claims that Sinclair makes. So there's a kind of communication and a synergy between the muckrakers, in this case Sinclair, and the power of the presidency. And it's through exposing people to the horrors that are going on that they can shift public opinion, bring pressure to bear on what is then a mostly Republican Congress that still tends to cater to corporate interests. Some things, I guess, don't change too much, right, or at least go in cycles. And it really is a landmark bill because it establishes the power of the federal government to do this kind of regulation of particular industries, which really, has not been done much at all before. And it's the beginning of a much more regulatory and intrusive state, to the kind that small government conservatives today still complain about, but most of us probably consider an essential function of providing at least minimum safety standards, minimum labor standards. Otherwise, in a complex, corporate-dominated society, there just wouldn't be sufficient protections for citizens and consumers.
Right. Roosevelt, if you could boil down his campaign to its essentials, it's that he's an activist on behalf of the common good, believing that because of the incredible changes that occurred during the Gilded Age, rampant industrialization and all the things you just mentioned, that somehow there needs to be some sort of counterbalance to the extraordinary power of people like John D. Rockefeller, and that the only person who can stand up to him and what he represents is the president. And he's going to do that by marshaling public opinion to get things like the Meat Inspection Act passed, along with so many other reforms that Roosevelt championed. It's really a transitional moment in American politics, isn't it?
Exactly. And to spin, as I, somewhat playfully call it, it's really what Roosevelt likes to call publicity. And he means that in two senses, primarily as the sense of making the private public, exposing whether it's corrupt government dealings or corrupt corporate practices, exposing them to the light of day where the public can see and judge it. Transparency, we would call it today. Publicity also in this period starts to take on its other meaning of promotion, even self-promotion. And the two meanings, although in some ways opposite, are really tied together, that Roosevelt is a master of publicity as self-promotion. He likes to command the headlines. He is one of the first presidents to create publicity stunts that he knows will get him on the front page or get him a picture that gets more attention than simply issuing a dull proclamation. But he's doing it also in the service of a publicity-centered reform agenda, one that wants to bring an agenda of publicity to the corporations and in some instances to government as well. So the two meanings are really linked, and Roosevelt, people sometimes in his day and even today derided him as juvenile, as an egotist, that he was just, loved the limelight. But I think if you look at the record closely, all those things may be true, but it's also tied to a deliberate strategy of advancing a clear political reform agenda.
Right. I see two things there that stand out as running themes. One is that each of these new innovations, each new president has to become the master of the newest tools and techniques, whatever they are, in terms of public relations. And then when they do master it, they come in for criticism for somehow being phony or being manipulative. And Theodore Roosevelt seems to be the first to experience that, both being seen as a master of spin, but also that has a dark side to it. And then TR's successor, Woodrow Wilson, he's a very different person in so many different ways. In fact, Wilson is very self-conscious about the fact that he's not the over-the-top personality that Roosevelt is. But Wilson, in his own way, uses some of the same tools and techniques as Roosevelt to pursue some of the same reform ideas of Roosevelt, in terms of corporate regulation, for example.
That's right. So to your first question, there is always a double-edged nature of spin. My own soundbite slogan, way I put it in the book, is spin is used for misleading, but it's also used for leading.
Mm-hmm.
Now, sometimes how we feel about it depends on our own political sensibilities. We admire presidents or politicians who are effective communicators with their words and their imagery when it is in the service of causes or candidates that we ourselves believe in. And in fact, in those cases, we might not even choose to call it spin. But it's when it's in the service of causes we believe are wrong, taking us into a war we oppose, pushing for or against policies, if we're on the opposite side, then we see spin as quite nefarious. And in Roosevelt's day, his critics in Congress, who did not like his reform agenda, chose to chalk up his popularity simply to his effectiveness with these new tools of communication and to his skill in winning great coverage from the Washington press corps. So Pitchfork Ben Tillman, Southern Democratic congressman who was always fighting with TR, was one of those who takes to the Senate floor to denounce Roosevelt as nothing but the showman, nothing but a manipulator of the press. And that's a theme that sort of I think every president has to contend with. When you achieve success, your critics not liking to admit that they lost in the realm of politics or in the realm of ideas, try to take comfort with the notion that maybe they lost in this somehow less legitimate or grubbier realm of public communication. So we see this with Reagan, how Democrats sort of negatively called him the great communicator, as if to diminish the power of his appeal. Republicans did the same with Bill Clinton. So every president, I think, struggles with this.
Isn't it true, especially of presidents who are highly successful, so that there's almost a correlation that the presidents who are seen as the greatest users of spin and who come in for the greatest criticism for using spin are also the presidents who have accomplished a lot, and that they've had what are considered successful presidencies. And that's what makes them successful. It's not the spin, even though that's what people tend to focus on. It's the fact that over their 4 or 8 years, they've actually accomplished important things. That's a really interesting correlation.
No, I agree. And again, to sort of go across a few different administrations for a moment before coming back to Wilson, we often think that presidents who are remembered as successful are remembered that way because they were good spinners. I came to conclude the reverse is pretty much true. Those who we remember as good spinners are remembered that way because they were successful. And in fact, there were several presidents who began their administrations with reputations as deft manipulators of the media, only to sort of fall on hard times, struggle with the press, struggle with their images more generally. And today, no one thinks of them that way. Herbert Hoover is a great example. When he came into office, Walter Lippmann and Haywood Brown and all these columnists wrote about him as having this very modern sensibility, being deft with the media. And it's only after the Depression hit and Hoover really struggled without much policy success to improve things economically that people saw this media magic wear off, as it were. He even at one point enlists Edward Bernays, one of the originators of American public relations, on a committee. And Bernays says, after trying with some of the slogans and press releases and stunts, Bernays sort of concludes, look, I'm not a magician here. You need a jobs program.
Pretty straightforward.
Right. Another case, just quickly, is Jimmy Carter. It was astonishing to me. I mean, I lived through this. I was young, but Carter was hailed as a media genius in his 1976 campaign and even into 1977. There's a New York Times Magazine cover that shows him as a kind of puppeteer in the control room of a television network controlling all three networks' images. He was seen as someone who really used television and the new media to vault to the presidency and to popularity. Of course, once you have the economy, tanks, and the hostage crisis and all these other things that Carter was fairly ineffective at combating, the notion of him being an effective communicator really fell away. But I think if Carter had managed to be a successful two-term president, we might remember him the way we now remember Reagan.
Yeah, that's a remarkable thing to consider. It's fascinating the way these two things are tied together. I wonder if we could circle back a bit to have you tell our listeners a little bit more about some of the innovations regarding spin that Woodrow Wilson helped develop. I'm thinking in particular his creation during World War I of the Committee on Public Information, an organization headed up by a man named George Creel. People have long pointed to the CPI as the first true propaganda machine in U.S. history.
Right, and I have, as you probably noticed, something of a revisionist account there of the Committee on Public Information. Not entirely revisionist, but the person he put in charge, in fact, was not from Madison Avenue, but was a muckraking progressive journalist, the name of George Creel, right, who had even written one of his great exposés as a muckraker about Ivy Lee, the public relations guru for the Rockefellers. These were men who were by and large progressives who believed they were leading and not misleading, to put it that way.
Right.
The vast majority of Creel's output was indeed information, as his committee's name suggested. And in fact, he got attacked much more by right-wing jingos who felt he was insufficiently angry and insufficiently emotional in the content that his committee put forth. Now, on the other hand, there is always a sort of perilous line between providing information and providing propaganda or emotionally laden, sometimes biased or partial fare that's designed to sort of whip up the emotions and not just to inform. And it's rare to find any government officer, who begins trying to provide information who doesn't, at least to some degree, succumb to the imperative to inject more emotionally laden content that we call propaganda. So Creel really struggles with this, and in some ways there are lessons in it for later presidencies. Franklin Roosevelt during World War II finds he doesn't have enough of a morale-building apparatus, and even talks about bringing back Creel at one point, which I also discovered, which is sort of astonishing. Instead, Archibald MacLeish, the poet and playwright, is called on to run what's called the Office of Facts and Figures, right? Again, like the Committee on Public Information, they want to hew to just neutral, non-propagandistic fare. But that office, too, eventually gets taken over by more Madison Avenue advertising types. It becomes the Office of War Information. And that ideal that we can persuade the people just through kind of bloodless, neutral information, I think has always been something of a false dream for liberals, that liberals like Wilson and Roosevelt want to win by pure reason and argumentation. And in fact, political opinions are shaped always by appeals to emotion as well.
Indeed. In fact, I hope to explore that point a little bit more as we get near the end of this interview and approach current events.
Right.
But back to FDR. With FDR, you note his successful use of two innovations. The first is radio, which isn't exactly new when he takes office, but FDR transforms radio into a new and highly effective tool of political communication, or spin if you like. And the other innovation emerging at the time is polling, public opinion polling, as a tool of politics. I'm certain our listeners want to know more about these two innovations and how FDR takes advantage of them.
Right. I mean, these are two important innovations of FDR. On radio, of course, in my last book on Calvin Coolidge, I made much of the fact that Coolidge, not Roosevelt, was the first radio president. He delivered an inaugural address that was heard coast to coast, a nomination acceptance address. A lot of major speeches were broadcast on radio. Yeah. More people heard Calvin Coolidge's voice on one speech than heard Theodore Roosevelt's voice, perhaps, throughout his career.
Yeah, he wasn't so silent. Silent Cal wasn't also all that silent.
Right, Silent Cal, and that's a misnomer. But what Coolidge never did was to write a speech expressly for radio. They hooked up a microphone and he gave the speech he would have given anyway. He was trained in sort of classical rhetoric. Roosevelt, with his fireside chats, which I'm sure listeners know about, designed these talks to be intimate, to be brief, to reach people in their living rooms. Mm-hmm. He spoke in a very different idiom. It was conversational. He called people my friends. He took pains to get the sound just right. Even before his going on the air, he would have his nostrils swabbed for tonal clarity. So this was really a performance, kind of show business performance of a different sort. But it connected with people emotionally in a different way from the old standard speeches. There are actually many people who tell this story, but I found one account by Saul Bellow as a young man who said he would sort of walk along the avenue in Chicago during a Roosevelt speech. People would be in their cars with their windows down, and he would hear the speech from one car radio after the next. Everybody joined in this common spirit of listening to the president. And these speeches did that. They helped forge a commonality, a bond among Americans during a very desperate and fractious time. And there was a sense of enriching democracy almost through the medium itself.
Right, that you couldn't have a small town meeting anymore, New England style, but maybe the radio would be the modern version of it, where politicians and the people could connect in some more direct way.
That's exactly right. And then when it came to polling, these were the years that people like George Gallup were just beginning to develop more scientific methods for taking accurate reads of public opinion. It used to be people would respond to surveys, they would mail in a response to a magazine, but there was no real way to know how representative your sample was. And even ideas like sampling were not really fully, in circulation. What's interesting is, although Gallup is working in the 30s, the man that Roosevelt turns to is more of a Nate Silver figure in that he actually doesn't conduct his own polling, but looks at everybody else's numbers and tries to sort of recalibrate them. So he looks at what the newspaper surveys say. He looks at what the canvasses by the state Democratic committees say. He looks even at what like bookies and gamblers are doing in the way people today look at sites like Predicted. And then he kind of aggregates this and tries to sort of figure out what it means. And at first he's kind of seen as a crackpot when he walks into the offices of the Democratic National Committee trying to sell his services. He comes out of the mining industry and oil and gas. But it was through that work that he understood that just as you can't take the chemical content of a piece of rock by shaving off the surface, you have to pulverize the whole thing to get a cross-section. So you can't get public opinion just by skimming the surface. You have to find some way to get through the whole thing. And he surprises everyone by making these devastatingly good predictions. James Farley, the chairman of the party, promotes him, allows him to write press releases so that both in 1932 and then even more surprisingly in the 1934 midterm elections, when the party in power usually loses congressional seats, right, Emil Hurria is predicting Democratic wins and is borne out. And he's put on Time magazine and called the Wizard of Washington.
Yeah, an early title for a Washington spinmeister.
Absolutely.
Well, it's fascinating. And equally fascinating, as we march ahead in this story, is thinking about the impact of the next big thing, which of course is television. And the president who's really confronted squarely by this new technology is Dwight D. Eisenhower. And Eisenhower, as we know, is the last president born in the 19th century. And he's not exactly old, but he's definitely up there in age when he takes office. And there's this new thing called television. Eisenhower has no experience with it, but he does seem to have, I guess, an awareness that it's an important thing, that he can't just ignore it like other presidents have ignored earlier forms of new technology. He realizes he needs to embrace it and to get good at it. So tell us what Eisenhower does to get up to speed as far as television goes.
Right. Eisenhower is not someone who has a natural instinct for television, but he's willing to trust in his advisors. And he has a lot of advisors who come from the world of advertising. Sig Larman from Young and Rubicam and others really are sort of pushing him to try to make use of this new technology. It helped especially in 1952 because his rival for the presidency, Adlai Stevenson, was totally contemptuous of TV and, thought it was beneath him to do television ads because this was selling candidates like soap or cornflakes. That sort of above-it-all attitude has often been the undoing of many candidates. You need to accommodate yourself to the language of contemporary politics, whatever it is, if it's Twitter or if it's TV or what it may be. So Eisenhower really, there are sort of many steps he takes to accommodate himself to TV. One is in the 1952 campaign itself, where he hires Rosser Reeves, this Madison Avenue advertising genius, to do the first ever 30-second spots. And they're very simple spots. You can go online and see them at The Living Room Candidate, which is a great website I send my students to. And it's Eisenhower Answers America, and they take a man off the street, give him a question to ask, cut to Eisenhower, who recites often a hokey line about what he's going to do to fight inflation or fight communism. These were effective. They were hardly brilliant ads, but yet the Democrats in that Stevensonian mode cry foul. They think this is somehow a huge degradation of the democratic process, and they even talk about having congressional investigations, for what it is not exactly clear. Now, Eisenhower was going to win that race, I think, no matter what, but his use of the television spots obviously sets a precedent that, again, especially once you get into the 70s and 80s and 90s, these ads become the currency of presidential elections. The other thing I'll mention for Eisenhower is that he brings into the White House the first ever West Wing TV coach, a man named Robert Montgomery. People may be more familiar with his bewitching daughter, Elizabeth, from the TV series. But Robert Montgomery was an actor, television producer himself. He had done some wartime radio plays and radio broadcasts for the government, so he was familiar with the sort of political uses of media. He was a Republican, and when he saw Eisenhower's initial television debut in 1952, where they were in Abilene, Kansas, his hometown, and at a baseball stadium, but the skies opened up, there was a downpour, and the bleachers behind him cleared out, and Eisenhower looked drab in his raincoat instead of his smart army khakis. The whole thing was a mess. So Montgomery places an emergency call to the campaign saying, you need help. And after the election, he's brought in to be a coach, and he works with Eisenhower on where to stand, how to deliver his speeches.
Doesn't he also advocate that Eisenhower change his eyewear, his glasses, and gets rid of the podium? Doesn't he see all kinds of important small details that can be changed to help Eisenhower come across better on TV?
Yeah, absolutely. Delivery, appearance. He plays with the color of his suits, puts them in some light blue suits on some occasions. When color TV is starting to come in, he really sort of wants the thing to look right. And Eisenhower, who, as you said, sort of begins really having no clue with television, by the end of his presidency, I argue, is actually a very effective television communicator. He gives these major speeches about Little Rock, the integration crisis at Central High School, about Sputnik when the Soviets, launched the first satellite. And the speeches he gives there are really these very memorable effective Oval Office addresses that sort of set the template for that mode of presidential communication, the Oval Office address, which, we see it somewhat less today, but it's still an important staple of presidential communication.
Absolutely. It's something I've always associated with the 60s, but it's clear from your book that it actually started back in the 50s with Eisenhower. Eisenhower, of course, is then followed by a much younger, telegenic John F. Kennedy. And you titled this chapter of the book, The Age of Image Making. It focuses on JFK and LBJ. So what makes this period a new phase in the evolution of spin and political communication?
Right. Well, a lot of the concern with image is driven by television for sure. So right around the Kennedy-Nixon debates, which in popular wisdom are said to rest on Kennedy's superior looks, although research doesn't entirely support that. There's a sort of old story that Nixon won on radio, but the evidence for that is pretty skimpy. But we do know that Kennedy's appearance, people watched him and heard him, that helped convince the public that this young man, who many people thought perhaps was too young, too callow, too inexperienced to be president, could hold his own with the vice president, could talk intelligently about policy, seemed to have some wit and poise to him. And so in that sense, certainly Kennedy's television appearance did help him, and it opened up the first lead in what had previously been a neck-and-neck polling contest. So the whole Kennedy apparatus, I think, feeds a discourse of image. There's a great book from the period, The Image by Daniel Boorstin, that is one in a long line of fretful, anxious worries about democracy and whether the emphasis on image, the emphasis on handsome appearances, telegenic appearances, will somehow supersede a more real politics. At one level, are we getting sold a bill of goods? Are we just sort of falling for who's attractive and articulate? But at another level, there's almost a kind of postmodern concern, even by this point, of what is all surface as opposed to something more real and durable. And these concerns, remain with us, I think, today. This is sort of the period where that anxiety about the image becomes really central to our politics.
Yeah, and it's an anxiety, as you note, that's still very much with us today. But today, of course, we live in a profoundly different world in terms of media and politics compared to the 1960s and 70s. I mean, those days kind of seem like the Stone Age compared to now when we think about the proliferation of news channels. I mean, cable news has completely changed the game in this era. It's essentially fractured the American viewing audience into smaller and smaller sub-audiences. In 1972, for example, a major address by the president would dominate TV ratings, but now, not so much. And then, of course, there's the internet and social media. So help us make sense of the status of spin and political communication now, especially in light of the 2016 presidential election.
Well, I define spin sort of quite broadly as any kind of partial communication, in the sense of partisan or taking one side, but also partial meaning something short of the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. But that's how politicians always communicate. It would be very strange if a president got up there and, said, here's the reasons why we should fire Tomahawk missiles at Syria, and then gave the reasons against and, in a kind of neutral blood tone, and then sort of asked people to vote or, weigh in. We expect, spin is a form of leadership. It's how we make our arguments. Now, there has always been this concern about when does spin or partial truth bleed into lies and falsehood. And that's been a concern at many points before, and it, of course, is again now today. I think it was a big deal in this last election, not so much because I think the explicitly fake news sites, whether those made by mercenaries just are trying to get people to click on phony stories for advertising revenue, or by, ideological sources, I think that's probably overblown. We really don't know how much that kind of sharing. We know it went on a lot, but we don't know how much it affected people's opinions. But I do think the more generally polarized political environment in which we lack the same, well, the sources are still there, but the authority of the news sources that aspire to objectivity has eroded.
Right. That seems to be a very important factor. The concerns about whether there exists now, at least in the public imagination, something called the mainstream media.
Right.
In a way that it was often referred to just a few decades ago.
Exactly. And in fact, the mainstream media is a relatively new term that had to be invented to define it against the partisan media and the non-mainstream media, because the non-mainstream media were suddenly having more influence. But there was a time, as your listeners know, when you could tune into CBS or read the New York Times, and while a conservative or somebody on the far left might quibble with the way a particular story was told or rendered, most of us would agree they were reliable sources of information. Over the years, those sources have gotten more opinionated, not, I would say, more liberal, but there's more voice, there's more analysis, there's more contextualization, which I think has been an effort to prevent people from being spun, to say, oh, the government's saying this, but here's the context. But it has sort of backfired in that people look at the mainstream media as, well, they're opinionated too. And the authority that they command, and then, of course, just the mere existence of more channels, whether it's talk radio, whether it's Fox, and now on the left, MSNBC, whether it's internet sources and social media, the people have at their fingertips the availability of so many other takes on the news that it's not always evident to people why they should turn to the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, what have you.
Yes, and there's, of course, been, as Nicole Hemmer points out in her recent book, Messengers of the Right, there's been a decades-long project, primarily from the right, to denigrate what we now call the mainstream media and to brand it as, opinionated and biased. And that's what's pushed this notion to a critical point in terms of undermining public confidence in traditional media sources, even for people who aren't necessarily hostile to the mainstream media. They just essentially have a question mark in their mind as they approach it.
That's exactly right. And that's true, in fact, since the 1960s, of many kinds of authority in the universities, in mainline religions, in other centers of authority that, say in the 1960s were generally trusted. And of course, this goes for the government above all, were generally trusted, today are generally distrusted. And so there's a kind of, radical doubt that's about. Some doubt, of course, is good in democracy. We shouldn't have a credulous public that believes too much in everything you read in the paper or what the government tells you. But we've reached a point where everybody's searching for their own authorities, which tend to be ones that confirm their pre-existing beliefs.
Well, I guess one thing the history of spin tells us is that an informed electorate is really important for the health of a democracy, and that people need to be really vigilant in assessing the media sources they rely on.
Right.
Well, David Greenberg, this has been a very informative and enjoyable conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us at In the Past Lane about your terrific and most timely book.
Oh, thank you, Ed. It's been fun talking, and many more conversations like this to come.
All right, thank you. David Greenberg is the author of The Republic of Spin, An Inside History of the American Presidency, out now in paperback by W.W. Norton. Okay, people, that's all for this episode of In the Past Lane. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe to this podcast at iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you access your podcasts. And tell your friends about In the Past Lane. That really helps to bring in new listeners. For more information about the many things we talked about today, head over to our show page for this episode at inthepastlane.com. I also want to hear from you, so please send us your comments, questions, and suggestions via Twitter, Instagram, and our Facebook page. I'm In the Past Lane's host, Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, reminding you that history explains our world. So let's pay attention to it. Thanks for listening. We hope you'll join us next time for another journey in the past lane. Hey, Lulu, did you know that the real Independence Day is actually July 2nd and not July 4th?
Why are you doing this to me?
SBI, Snoring Beagle International.